Welcome to the video for chapter 14 of the Cambridge Introduction to Sanskrit, which is going to tell you about compound nouns. So first of all, what are compound nouns? These are nouns, or actually also adjectives, that consist of more than one stem. So for example, in English, words such as toothpaste, consisting of tooth and paste, would be considered a compound noun. Ruby red, treehouse, chewing gum, sword fight, bookseller, and so on. All of these would be considered compounds. Compounds in Sanskrit are principally like English counterparts, however there are two differences. The first is that they are often made up on the spot, and the second is that as a result, Sanskrit compounds are thus far more frequent than compounds in English. So in Sanskrit, for example, I might say Rama Vachana, a compound, literally Rama command, instead of saying a command of Rama, a command from Rama, a command by Rama. So I could phrase this as just one word, as one compound. I could also say Priyajana, literally dear person, rather than using two words, dear and person, individually to describe someone. A very noticeable feature of Sanskrit compounds is that of the members of a compound, i.e. of the words used in a compound, it's typically just the final one that has a case ending. All the others before the final one are put just in their stem form. So for example, the compound Ashwa Kovidach, which literally means horse-skilled or skilled with horses, consists of the elements Ashwa, meaning horse, and Kovidach, meaning knowledgeable or skilled. Kovidach, the final member of this compound, does indeed have an ending. In this case, we've got it in the nominative singular masculine. But Ashwa, the first member of this compound, stands in just the stem form. This is typical of Sanskrit compounds. If we wanted to render this expression by means of independent words, then the first word, Ashwa, would indeed also have to have an ending. So for example, we could say Ashwanan Kovidach or Ashweshu Kovidach. Both of these would be syntactically correct, and the first would mean literally skilled or knowledgeable of horses, and the second one skilled or knowledgeable in respect to horses. But in both of them, the point here is that Ashwa would indeed require a case ending. In a compound, the first member, or all but the final member, don't require a case ending. This actually also is the case in English, but there it's hardly noticeable because there is little to no difference between a noun and the stem form of a noun. But if you look at compounds such as sword fight, bookseller, or toothpaste, you should remark that, or you should note that, a sword fight doesn't use just one sword, but almost by definition, a sword fight will be of between two or more swords. A bookseller hopefully is going to sell more than one book, and toothpaste, one would hope, is for more than one tooth. Still, the words are not swords fight bookseller or teeth paste, because the first word that we've got here, sword, book, and tooth, what looks like a singular, actually is not a singular, but the stem of these words. There are some exceptions to this rule that everything except for the final member stands in just the stem, and if you want to know more about those exceptions, you should turn to the book for some discussion. There are several different compound types that are distinguished on the basis of the relation that the compound parts, or so-called compound members, have to one another. For example, if you look at Blackbird versus Toothbrush, a blackbird is a bird that is so called because it is black. But a toothbrush is not a brush that is a tooth, rather it is a brush for one's teeth. In other words, the relationship between black and bird is different from the relationship between tooth and brush, and therefore we would consider these compounds as belonging to different types or different categories. These categories were identified by ancient Indian grammarians a very long time ago, and they were, for the most part, adopted by Western grammarians. And there are Sanskrit and English terms for each of these compound types, and both of these terms are commonly in use, and therefore both of these types, both the Sanskrit and the English terminology, will be introduced and explained in this book. First up, we have determinative compounds. In these, the whole compound is what the second member is, and the first member determines, i.e. tells us more about that second member. They come in two different varieties. The first one is the so-called karmadharaya, or in English terminology, the descriptive determinative. This is so called because the first element describes the second element. The alternative is a tatpurusha, or a dependent determinative, that is so called because the first member is dependent on the second. Of karmadharayas, we have English examples such as Blackbird, a bird that is black, whiteboard, a board that is white, or ruby red, a red that is like a ruby that is like a ruby's. And among the various Sanskrit examples, we have, for example, Maharaja, a king who is great, so a great king or a Maharaja. Among the tatpurushas, or dependent determinatives, we have English examples such as treehouse, which is not a house that is a tree, but a house that is in a tree, a gunfight, a fight with guns, a cookbook, a book for cooks or for cooking, sightseeing, seeing whom or what, the sights. And among Sanskrit examples, we have such words as Dewapati, which is the Pati, the Lord, Dewa, of the gods, or Vedavid, meaning someone who knows the Vedas, someone who is Veda knowing. Vid is a verbal root meaning to know. Next up are bahuvrihis, or so-called possessive compounds. Possessive compounds are all adjectives of a bahuvrihi consisting of the members A, B. The meaning is someone or something whose B is A. Rather abstract, so let's look at a couple of examples. In English, barefoot is not a foot that is bare, but someone whose feet are bare. And lightweight is not a light weight, but someone or something whose weight is light. So if barefoot is AB, then the meaning is someone whose B, whose foot or feet, are A, namely bare. Sanskrit has many examples of these. Of mukha, which means face, we get, for example, ashwa mukha, meaning someone whose face is a horse's, is horse-like, someone who has a face like a horse. Nata mukha, someone whose face is nata, is bent. So someone who is bent-faced, someone whose face is bent down, i.e. someone who is looking down. Pratimukha, literally someone whose face is towards, who is towards-faced, i.e. someone who is facing someone. Chaturmukha, someone whose face or whose faces are four, so someone who is four-faced, who has four faces, and that would be a description of the god Brahma. Bahuvrihis basically work the same way in English as in Sanskrit, but in Sanskrit they are once again far more frequent and far more varied, and given their great frequency, it's actually worth emphasizing 3 points about them. First of all, if an idea can be expressed as a bahuvrihi, Sanskrit often does express it as such, which leads to words such as eka purva, literally whose previous purva is one, eka, which is used in the feminine eka purva to describe a woman who has been married once before. We get words such as a janu bahu. A means two, janu means knee, bahu means arm, so this describes someone who is two-knee armed, i.e. whose arms are or reach to his knees. Then we get words like hataputra, which literally is killed son, i.e. someone whose son or whose sons have been killed. Secondly, the basic translation of a bahuvrihi x, y usually is someone or something whose y is x or is like x. You should use this as a starting point for your translation, but this basic translation is rarely idiomatic in English, and so you may have to translate a little more freely, such as someone who has an x that is y or that is like y, or someone who is x-wide, such as brown-eyed. Sometimes you will find that there's actually an instrumental relation between the members of a bahuvrihi. For example, jita klama is not someone whose fatigue, klama, is overcome or is defeated, jita, but rather it is someone by whom fatigue has been overcome. When you have such an instrumental bahuvrihi, Very often it's even more idiomatic to translate passive participles actively. So jita klama would not be someone by whom fatigue has been overcome, but someone who has overcome his fatigue. Often you need to actually be even more individual and even more free in your translations of Bahovrihis into English. An example of this would be pratimukha, which we looked at earlier, which is not towards faced, or someone whose face is towards, or someone who has a face that is towards, but rather it's simply turned towards, or even simpler, facing. Thirdly and lastly, the fact that Bahovrihis are adjectives helps, or at least may help, in recognizing them. Sometimes it's a little difficult to notice. Now, nouns or substantives have one fixed gender. So, for example, narach is masculine, nari is feminine, sena is feminine, and so on. But adjectives, on the other hand, agree in gender with the noun that they describe, and so they need to have forms for all three genders. If a noun at the end of a compound stands in a gender that is not its own, then we can tell that the compound is a Bahovrihi. Now that sounds a little abstract, so let's look at an example. Mukha, meaning mouth or face, is a noun that is neuter, so the nominative singular of that would be mukham. But if we see a masculine form ashwa mukhach, where we find this form all of a sudden appearing with a masculine ending, we can tell from the fact that all of a sudden it has changed its gender that the compound that we're looking at as a whole has to be an adjective, i.e. a form that can change its gender, masculine, feminine, and neuter, and therefore that the compound we're looking at is a Bahovrihi. And so, for example, if we have a phrase such as ashwa mukhach narach, then what we're looking at in ashwa mukhach must be someone, in this case narach, a man, whose face, mukhach, is a horse's, so a horse-faced man. Next up, we have dvandvas, or so-called coordinative compounds. Dvandvas combine members that would otherwise be linked with and. So, for example, Surya Chandrau is a dvandva that literally means sun-moon, and that we need to translate as sun and moon. Putra Pautrach, literally children-grandchildren, would have to be translated into English as children and grandchildren. Dvandvas stand in the dual when they refer to exactly two things. So, for example, Surya Chandrau stands in the dual, nominative dual, because it refers to one, the sun, two, the moon, to exactly two things. Dvandvas stand in the plural when they refer to more than two things. So, for example, putra pautrach, children and grandchildren. But when dvandvas stand in the plural, then the context of the word in its sentence is important, because putra pautrach is more than two of these. So it could be one child and several grandchildren, several children and one grandchild, or several children and several grandchildren. Which of these we're dealing with, we can only infer from the context of the word. Originally, Sanskrit, or more specifically Vedic, used dvandvas only rarely and only of natural pairs and only with two members. For example, Dyawa Prithvi, which is heaven-earth, or in English, heaven and earth. But by epic and classical Sanskrit, which is what we're here focusing on, dvandvas would be used with many members, not just two, and members of all kinds that might just be listed together without naturally having anything to do with each other. So, for example, you find dhanya ayuda udakaich, which means with money, grain, weapons, and water. Those were the main kinds of Sanskrit compound types. There are more, but we're not going to focus on them in this book. Now, to look at the terminology that we've been using, the names of at least some Sanskrit compound types actually exemplify that type. Tat Purusha literally is a man or a servant of him. Tat is the stem of the masculine pronoun he, or this one, and so Tat Purusha is the servant of him, or his servant. Karmadharaya, the meaning of that is actually completely unclear. We're not quite sure why it's used or what exactly it is supposed to mean. Bahuvrihi, on the other hand, does have a meaning, and it's literally much riced. Bahu means much and vrihi means rice. So someone whose rice is much, someone who has much rice. And it's originally used to describe fertile land, but later it's used in the broader sense of rich. So not just of fields or of land, but also of people. And then finally, a dwandwa is literally a dwam, which is two, and literally means a pair or a couple. Now that you know the main types of Sanskrit compound, the question arises, when you read a Sanskrit text and you come across a compound, how do you analyze it? How do you identify what type it belongs to and therefore quite simply what it means? Now usually understanding the meaning of the compound members will allow you to understand the compound as a whole. So for example, when you see an English word such as handmade, you'll be able to understand that that means made by hand. But if you see a word such as homemade, you'll be able to understand without any problems that it means made at home. The connotations of a compound or of compound members also help. For example, the word Raja Putri consists of the words Raja, meaning king, and Putri, meaning daughter. You're very likely to interpret that as the daughter of a king, so as a Tatpurusha, simply because it's very unlikely to be a Karmadaraya, a daughter who is a king. A daughter would be a queen. It's also very unlikely to be a Bahuvrihi, someone whose daughter is a king, because again, a daughter would be a queen. And it also cannot be a Dwandwa, because a Dwandwa would have to be in the dual or in the plural. However, look at a word such as Raja Putrach. Raja again means king, and Putrach would be sons in the nominative plural. Is this a Tatpurusha, meaning the sons of a king or of kings? Is it a Karmadaraya, meaning sons who are kings, i.e. royal sons? Is it a Bahuvrihi, people whose sons are kings? Or is it maybe even a Dwandwa, kings and their sons? Whenever a compound in itself is ambiguous, you'll need to look at its context, i.e. at the sentence in which it stands, and determine from that what type of compound you're looking at and what therefore the compound means. However, wherever the compound meaning is specialized in some way, and so not even the context helps you, the dictionary will list that compound specifically. And so whenever you absolutely cannot figure out what a compound means, even if you know the meaning of its members, look it up in a dictionary and see whether it is listed there. And finally, something that will only become truly relevant once you start reading actual Sanskrit texts, longer compounds, that is, compounds with more than two members, are quite frequent in Sanskrit and actually very frequent in some literary genres. And those will also contain very long compounds, so compounds with 6, 7, 8, 10 and more members. Now, while that sounds a little scary, actually, all of these compounds belong just to the types that we've just encountered. And they can be split up into two-member compounds, but one of the members of these compounds will then be itself a compound that can thus be split up further. So, for example, a compound with just in quotation marks, 3 members, Rajya Sukha Lobach, consists of the members Rajya, royal, Sukha, happiness, and Lobach, meaning greed. And what we have here is a Karmadaraya, Rajya Sukha, meaning royal happiness, and that Karmadaraya exists within a Tatpurusha. The Tatpurusha has 2 members, greed is one member, and royal happiness is the other member, so that the compound as a whole, Rajya Sukha Lobach, means greed for royal happiness. Another example, Janma Bandha Vinirmuktah, consists of the members Janma, meaning birth, or here birth and rebirth, the cycle of births, Bandha, which means bondage, and finally Vinirmuktah, which means freed or freed from. So literally this is rebirth, bondage, freed. This compound consists of a Tatpurusha, Janma Bandha, the bondage of rebirth, of birth and rebirth, which stands within another Tatpurusha, namely freed from is the first member, or is one member of this Tatpurusha, and the other member of the Tatpurusha is the bondage of rebirth. And so the compound as a whole means freed from the bondage of rebirth. So when you encounter such a longer compound, you translate its individual members, and then you see how you need to group and subgroup them, and then you put them all together again to translate or to arrive at the meaning of the compound as a whole. That was it for this chapter. We hope that you found this video helpful, and if you have any comments or suggestions, we would love to hear from you. Please do write to us at ruppel@cambridge-sanskrit.org. And now, for your own work on this material, good luck and have fun!